Welcome to this webinar by the University of Bath. If you're looking for a webinar by the University of Bath called So You Want to Be a Translator or Interpreter, then you're in the right place. And I can see one of our current students has just joined. So welcome. Welcome to everyone. Two of our current students have just joined. How wonderful to see you. Lots of people coming in now. Welcome to this webinar by the University of Bath called So You Want to Be a Translator or Interpreter. It's wonderful to have you with us. We're delighted that you've come along this afternoon. If you would like to write in the chat and let us know where you're from and a little bit about yourselves, then you're most welcome to do so. Thank you, Thais. You've made a comment in the chat. It's lovely to have you with us. Already we have 15 people in our audience, so that's fantastic. Thank you very much for joining us this afternoon. Hope you've been enjoying the language show so far. There's a great variety of talks out there, and this is just one of them. So if you're looking for a talk on So You Want to Be a Translator or Interpreter by the University of Bath, you're in the right place. A very warm welcome to everyone who's joining us for this talk by the University of Bath called So You Want to Be a Translator or Interpreter. Thank you very much for joining us this afternoon. It's so wonderful to see so many of you joining us already. If you want to write in the chat to tell us who you are, where you're from, we'd love to hear from you. And we'll be starting very shortly. We just want to give a little bit more time for a few more people to join us in the audience. Numbers are creeping up steadily, which is fantastic. We're told that over 100 people had bookmarked the session to join us, although we know some of those people will be watching on demand afterwards. The session will be recorded, of course, so that you can either rewatch it or if you haven't watched it live, so that you'll be able to watch it afterwards. And already we're seeing in the chat that, very interesting, Anita, interested in becoming a literary translator. How fantastic. Working between English and German. That's lovely. Please do also write in the chat if you want to tell us where you're from. Oh, that's lovely. Somebody from York. I'm from York. So that's fantastic that we have someone in the audience from York who has an undergraduate degree in French and German. Amazing. That's lovely to see. And then we have, by contrast, somebody from the UK, from London, who's been working as a translator or interpreter for more than 20 years already. So I think that just illustrates the range of people in the audience that we're going to have this afternoon. We'll just give it another minute and then we'll kick off, I think. Yes, a very warm welcome to everyone. Just to reiterate my colleague Catherine's words in the chat, a very warm welcome to all of you. It's wonderful to have you with us. This is so interesting. So we have Alison from Bristol. Hello, Alison, translating from German and Norwegian. That's very exotic into UK English. Fantastic. And hello from Budapest. Amazing. Studying at Budapest University. Amazing. Hungarian, German and English. Well, I think, colleagues, we should probably get started if that's all right with you. Ladies and gentlemen, a very warm welcome once again to this webinar entitled So You Want to Be a Translator or Interpreter. And over the course of the next 45 minutes, we're going to be explaining how to access a career as a translator or interpreter. We're going to provide information about the variety of careers open to qualified translators and interpreters. We're going to tell you a bit about the different routes into those careers, one of which is, of course, to complete an MA at the University of Bath. And you'll be pleased to hear that one of our main messages for you today is the heartening news that there's currently significant demand, in particular for English mother tongue linguists in international organisations, including the EU institutions and the UN. We hope you'll have lots of questions. We'd invite you, please, to put any questions that you might have in the Q&A rather than in the chat. So if you look at your Zoom menu bar, you'll see one called Q&A. If you click on that, you'll be able to add your questions, and you'll also be able to see any other questions that have already been asked. You can upvote any that you're particularly interested in, and we're going to allow around 15 minutes at the end of the session to answer your questions. So first things first, we'd like to start with some introductions. My name, as you can see, is Louise Jarvis, and I'm joined by two colleagues from the University of Bath for this webinar this afternoon, Miguel Fiallo and Catherine Wells. We're all professional linguists, but we all have different professional profiles, which is, of course, a very nice illustration of the variety of careers open to translators and interpreters. So I'll go first. I'm a freelance conference interpreter and translator. I work from French, German, and Spanish into English, and I mainly work for international organisations, places like the EU institutions, the European Patent Office, the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, and the International Court of Justice. Miguel, would you like to introduce yourself?
Thanks, Louise. Hello, everyone. My name is Miguel Fiallo. I am Director of Studies for the Interpreting and Translating Programs at the University of Bath. I also work as a freelance interpreter, mainly for the EU institutions and the Portuguese government. And I work from Portuguese into Chinese and back to Portuguese, and also between Chinese and English. I also work as a freelance film subtitler, so I often translate subtitles for Chinese films.
Thank you. Catherine, over to you.
Thanks, Louise. Hello, everybody. My name's Catherine, and I'm a freelance translator, précis writer, and editor. And I work mainly within the United Nations system. So organisations like the World Health Organization, the International Labour Organization, the International Atomic Energy Agency, and the International Telecommunication Union, where I'm actually working at the moment. I work from Spanish, French, and Russian into English, and occasionally from Portuguese and Croatian, but those don't come up very often in the international institutions for reasons we'll explain later on.
Thank you, both of you. Now it's your turn in the audience today. We'd like to find out who you are. We'd like to get an idea of who's here today. So I'm going to launch a poll so that you can tell us about yourselves. That should have appeared on your screen now. Please tick any of the statements that apply to you. So whether you're at school, at university, already working as a translator or interpreter, working in a different field, whether or not you're passionate about languages. We're hoping for a high score on that one. So tick any of the statements that apply to you, any or all of them, and then we'll just have a quick look at the results. That was wonderful. Thank you very much for taking part. So we have already some very interesting results. So 6% of participants at school, 23% at university, a high number already working as a translator or interpreter, which is very interesting. 38% working in a different field, also interesting. And 68%, not 100%, passionate about languages. 69%, it's creeping up. Well, that's wonderful to see. And hopefully you can see the results on your screen now. So there we are. And that's very interesting for us as we move forward with our presentation. But I wanted really to segue into the next slide and say that being passionate about languages is really the most important prerequisite for being a translator or interpreter. Anyone with a passion for languages can decide to train as a translator and or interpreter at any point in their life. And an important point that we'd like to emphasise is that you don't need to be the finished product when you embark on a training pathway towards being a translator or interpreter. The training is designed to give you the skills that you'll need in those professions. But what you do need is a solid knowledge of your foreign languages and an aptitude for the jobs. And we'll come back to what we mean by an aptitude for the jobs later on in the presentation. Secondly, you can decide to train as a translator or interpreter or retrain at any point in your life. And we see this at Bath with our students. For example, at Bath, we do have students who've just finished their undergraduate degrees, but we also have students who have done a degree and then spent time in countries where their languages are spoken. Often they've taught in schools or universities. We also have more mature students who've maybe decided to retrain after a career in a different profession. And certainly I've had several former teachers as students over the years who now, of course, are colleagues, which is very nice.
So this is a great time to train if you're interested in pursuing translation and interpreting further. There is considerable demand for English mother tongue linguists in particular in the international institutions. And we know that for a number of years now, unfortunately, the proportion of people studying languages at school and university in the UK in particular has been falling. Now, obviously, on a personal level, this is dreadful, but professionally, it means that there is significant demand for English mother tongue linguists with these skills. And the skills that you can acquire by training as a translator or editor or interpreter will fit you for a number of roles, not just those purely linguistic roles like translation and interpreting and the related roles, but others as well. And we will talk about a few of those in due course. There are, of course, challenges, not least from the European point of view, the UK's withdrawal from the European Union. But although UK nationals are no longer employed as staff linguists with the EU institutions, that is to say in full-time posts, they can still work for the EU on a freelance basis, and a lot of them do. The advent of artificial intelligence of late, AI, and other technological developments obviously are challenging, and they have an effect on the professions. But what we're seeing at the moment really is evolution in the professions and not any reduction in demand for linguists. It's simply that the skills we have and the way we apply those skills, that's changing. But we can see that there will continue to be a need for English language linguists in particular, and I think increasingly on the editing side as well as the translation and interpreting side. So this is a great time to be thinking about moving into this sector. Thanks, Louise.
So I'm going to tell you a little bit about the differences between translation and interpreting. I'm one of those people that straddles both worlds because I do both interpreting and film subtitling. But we're going to come back to that in a second because film subtitling is a bit of a special one. It's a different kettle of fish. Essentially, translating is really about reading and writing, and interpreting is about listening and speaking. And this is one of the things I think a lot of people don't really understand all the time. One of the most annoying things is when you're watching a film, at least for me, when you're watching a film or a TV series, and they always say that the interpreter is the translator. It annoys me not because one is better than the other, simply because they're different. They do different things. And so normally the person they're referring to is an interpreter because they're dealing with the spoken word rather than the written word. So generally speaking, one of the other differences between interpreting and translation is that with translation, you generally have a lot more time to think about how you're going to craft your final text. Whereas with interpreting, everything happens in real time. So you're listening to a speech, you're analyzing that speech, processing it, and then producing something in the other language in the moment, spontaneously. And that means that what you're doing is you're trying to grasp a message and then conveying it into another language you're not looking for a word-for-word translation here. You're looking for conveying messages or ideas. With translation, that does happen to a certain extent, but with translation, there is a higher level for accuracy. So you need to make sure that you can alter the sentence structure slightly, you can alter the vocabulary slightly, but generally speaking, because you've got more time to think about it, you can often think of a better term. And so you have time to perfect your output, whereas with interpreting, you're constantly thinking on your feet and making an impression. Making an impression, I say making an impression, that really means that often means when you're interpreting, you're actually acting as well. You're often standing in front of a large group of people and performing to them. And that means that you have to deal with a lot of pressure. You have to be able to overcome those nerves. And generally speaking, people who are good consecutive interpreters working in front of an audience are people who can handle those kind of highly pressurized situations. With translation, it's a slightly, I would say, lonelier job. You're often sitting by yourself doing a translation, sometimes working in a team, of course, but it's a very different it's very different in terms of who you're engaging with and when you're engaging with them. So with interpreting, it's rarely as precise as translation. With translation, there's a higher level in terms of accuracy. One of the exceptions to this, I think, would be film subtitling, which is something I'm very much involved with. I think film subtitling is in some ways translation, but it's also very similar to interpreting in some ways as well, because what you're trying to do is you're trying to convey the message of a particular speaker in the film, a particular character, and you've only got a very limited space to do that. And subtitle often goes by very, very quickly. So you need to make sure that you grasp the essence of that message and put it in a subtitle that's understandable to everyone. And that's very similar to the way interpreters work. So because translation is often a much more precise science than interpreting, it does mean that different personality types might be more suited to doing translation or interpreting. If you're an interpreter, you're sitting in the booth, after 20 minutes, you've done your job, or after a whole day of doing 20-minute stints, you've finished your work, you go back home. Most interpreters forget about it. They don't really think about what happened during that day. The next day, they're doing something completely different. So if you're someone who loves detail, and if you're someone who wants everything to be 100% perfect, interpreting may not be the best thing for you, because every interpreting job that you do, you'll never be 100% satisfied because it's done in the moment. With translation, you often find that translators have a much higher level of detail, and they tend to be much more accurate. They pay attention to detail. So that's something that can be a very useful trait if you want to be a professional translator, proofreader, editor, etc. Interpreting is sometimes recorded, but generally speaking, you don't really have very much to show for your work. So you go into a meeting, you do your interpreting, and everyone forgets about it afterwards. Obviously, it's important. What you're doing is important, but after that day's work, you don't really have anything to show for it. With translation, obviously, it can be a lovely thing to have your translation on a brochure that a company's sending out to potential clients, for example, or having your translation on a website, or in my case, for example, being able to see a film in the cinema that's been subtitled by me. So it's a wonderful thing to be able to do that. With translation, obviously, the advantage is that you are working to a deadline. Sometimes the deadlines can be very tight, but generally speaking, you have a little bit more time to think about the perfect sentence, or at least try to get your translation as close to perfect as possible. With interpreting, everything is immediate, so everything's in the moment. The nice thing about both translation and interpreting is that you're exposed to a wide range of topics and speakers, and it's absolutely fantastic. So for example, in my experience, as a translator and an interpreter, and this is an example where the two meet. So for example, I translated a film, did the subtitles for a Chinese film a few years ago. That was then shown at the Cannes Film Festival. And then they asked me to interpret for the director at the Cannes Film Festival because I was familiar with the film. So that's a nice example of where these two can come together. And I also worked as an interpreter for, many different human rights fora in China. And that can sometimes be a very harrowing experience, sometimes a very sensitive topic. So I've worked, for example, with victims of torture. I've worked in meetings where people who had been sentenced to death had been discussed. So it can be very, very stressful. So I would say that if you want to be an interpreter, you have to bear in mind that it can be a very stressful experience. Translation can also be stressful, but I think interpreting, because it's all in the moment, it can be extremely nerve-wracking.
And here we have some of those careers that we've mentioned already. Some of what's on the screen now might be familiar to you. Some of them are probably less familiar, but we'll just go through a few of them and talk a little bit about what they involve. So translator, that's fairly straightforward. As a translator, you're dealing with written texts, as Miguel has just explained, from a foreign language, usually into your native language. That's not always the case. It depends a little bit on the language pairs involved. Rarer languages where there simply aren't native speakers of the target language who can work from the language, from the foreign language. There might be other options and people might work out of their native language, but generally speaking, and in particular for the international organizations, what we're dealing with is working from foreign languages into your native language. And that applies also within the international organizations to interpreting in quite a lot of cases, but not all of them. So a translator works with written texts, so does an editor, but they will be responsible for making sure that the text reads well, usually only working with one language at a time, but again, not exclusively. Within the UN, there are editors who work with more than one language at a time. A recent job that I did was to edit an English document, but working from a Spanish mastered version of the same document that had already been edited by a Spanish speaker. So my job was not only to edit the English to make sure that it read well and was accurate and had the correct formatting and the house style applied, but also to look at the changes that had been made to the Spanish and incorporate any that were relevant to the English into my English text. A reviser will usually be somebody who looks at a translation that's been done already by somebody else and checks it for accuracy, for style, for house style. So making sure that the terminology used is consistent with, for instance, the way that the UN or the EU or whoever likes their terms to be applied. You will find with language roles that some variation in terminology is out there. So sometimes a reviser will be understood as somebody who looks at only one language, just the output. Within the UN, a reviser is normally somebody who will look at the original language and the translation and compare them. But with both interpreting, with revising and proofreading, you'll find that there is some variation in terminology. A proofreader is usually somebody who intervenes at a later stage in the process and makes sure that all of the previous stages are accurately reflected in the final document. So literally, it used to be reading proofs before the document was printed for the final time. Nowadays, of course, most things are electronic, not on paper. But a proofreader will be working probably with a document that may have already been translated and edited and revised. And their job is to make sure that everything that all of the people involved in the document up to that point wanted to be reflected in that document is reflected in that document. A verbatim reporter and a précis writer on the right-hand side there, both of these roles are to do with record keeping for institutional bodies. So verbatim reporters will work for organisations like Parliament in the UK. You may have heard of Hansard, which is the official record of what goes on in Parliament in both the House of Commons and the House of Lords in the UK. And they will be taking notes of what is said in Parliament and then producing a word-for-word transcript, essentially, but slightly edited. That role is also seen within the United Nations for large, high-profile and politically sensitive bodies like the Security Council. A précis writer is somebody who produces essentially minutes of meetings within the UN, and those tend to be summarized records, not verbatim records. They're commonly used for technical committees, human rights committees, all sorts of other bodies. This is something that I do quite a lot of, again, for the UN itself and for the WHO, the World Health Organization, for other technical organizations within the UN system. A subtitler, well, Miguel's already explained quite a bit about that and how he is involved, and that this is quite a specific role. A colleague of mine also works in audiovisual translation, which is a related field, producing translations of scripts for films, essentially. On the left-hand side of the screen here, you'll see another 3 roles. A lawyer linguist is a particularly specialized role within the EU in particular. There are a few other institutions that employ lawyer linguists, but it is primarily within the EU institutions that you'll see this. And a lawyer linguist is somebody who is qualified in both professions, so law and translation. And they will work with multilingual legislation to make sure that laws that are adopted across the EU, in this case, say exactly the same in all the languages that they're adopted in. And they will also have the legal expertise to check content in a way that translators who are only qualified in languages don't necessarily. Although, as we'll explain in due course, quite a lot of translators do specialize in a particular field. A language analyst is a role commonly within the intelligence or security services. So in the UK, GCHQ or MI5. And down at the bottom there, conference translator, a very commonly misunderstood term. A lot of people would think it refers to a conference interpreter. But as Miguel has explained, interpreters are dealing with spoken language and translators are dealing with written language. But there is actually a small subset of the translation profession that is conference translation. And this is, again, something that I do quite a lot of. Effectively, it means working for conferences, but providing the translation services. And so the time pressures are usually much greater. The conference that I'm preparing for now will have an editorial committee that looks at all the texts that are going to be adopted by that conference and makes sure that all the language versions are aligned. And that is something that a conference translator would do. So we're working under pressure, quite often fairly antisocial hours, but we have the satisfaction of seeing that what we produce is adopted at the end of a conference and is signed off on by all the delegates there. And in the case of the particular conference I'm preparing for at the moment, will actually become international law because it's what's known as a treaty-making conference. It is revising an international treaty. So that's just a few of the different roles that linguists are employed in across the United Nations system and the EU, and a lot of different bodies as well. Thanks.
Thanks, Catherine. Yes, it's amazing, isn't it, to see the variety of roles that that training as a translator and or interpreter will open the doors to. And the same is true on the interpreting side of the equation. And I just wanted to give you a flavour of that now. There are different types of interpreting, as I'm sure many of you in the audience are already aware, which are performed in different contexts. And similarly, if you train as an interpreter, different doors are opened depending often on your language combination and on market demand for your language combination. So I think the first thing to say is that all types of interpreting rely on a combination of consecutive interpreting and simultaneous interpreting. And those, if you decide to train as an interpreter, those are the 2 skills that you'll be trained in. Just to explain what they are, consecutive interpreting is when a speaker makes a speech of typically up to around 8 minutes. The interpreter takes notes and then the interpreter reconstitutes the speech on the basis of the notes and their memory in the target language. And this is really the kind of interpreting that Miguel was referring to earlier when he talked about performance. Consecutive interpreting is very much a performance. Simultaneous interpreting is in a way less of a performance because you're hidden away in a soundproof booth, and you don't have to stand up in front of a large audience, although you are still performing, I think, with your voice. Anyway, as the name suggests, simultaneous interpreting is obviously when the interpreter works almost simultaneously, so speaking at the same time as the original speaker. And on this slide, I've tried to just give you a flavour of the different roles in which these skills can be applied. So if we take the picture on the top left, that is meant to illustrate conference interpreting. So if you're a conference interpreter, you'll typically work in long consecutive and simultaneous from a booth. The picture shows it's a very small picture, sorry about that, but it's a picture of a European Council meeting in Brussels. And at European Council meetings, interpreting is provided from 24 languages into 24, so it's quite an undertaking. The interpreters sit in soundproof booths around the edge of the room. So there would have been 24 booths occupied in this meeting, one for each language. And in each booth, there would have been 3 interpreters, making a grand total of 72 conference interpreters servicing that meeting. Beautiful room. I've worked there myself. It's in Brussels, in the council building. The second example, if we turn to the picture on the top right, is diplomatic interpreting. And I've illustrated that with a cartoon where we can see a meeting between Mr. Macron and Mr. Putin. You can see, it's very rare to see a cartoon that includes interpreters, but in this case, we can see that each of the presidents has their interpreter standing behind them. So Mr. Macron's interpreter will interpret everything he says from French into Russian. Mr. Putin's interpreter will interpret everything he says from Russian into French. So this is a very specialized role where you would you would probably be working in consecutive or simultaneous, depending on the situation. In a meeting like that, it would be consecutive or whispering. Whispering is a form of simultaneous interpreting without a booth. But then there might be a press conference afterwards, and you might end up sitting in a booth to do the press conference. Thirdly, we have business interpreting, and that's illustrated by the picture on the bottom left. This is where the interpreter would work in 2 directions. So say from French into English and from English into French. Often in shorter bursts of text, of speech. They would use consecutive interpreting or whispering, as I've already explained. And then public service interpreting on the bottom right is similar, but it's for the police, the courts, and in hospitals. And there are special qualifications in public service interpreting, which we'll come on to talk about later.
So now we're on to where translators and interpreters work. So you can see a long list of organizations that hire interpreters and translators as in-house professionals. These include, for example, the United Nations and all its agencies and organs, the institutions, meaning the European Parliament, the European Commission, the European Council, and international courts as well, the ICJ, ECJ. You can look all these up. They hire interpreters and translators, and obviously organizations outside the European Union and the UN, like NATO, Council of Europe, etc. And obviously also, as was mentioned already, you may be working as a translator or interpreter for intelligence services, Ministry of Defense, GCHQ, etc. In the market, there are also some NGOs that will hire in-house translators or interpreters. The same goes for sporting associations and businesses. Obviously, generally speaking, for NGOs and businesses, they will often hire interpreters on a freelance basis and translators on a freelance basis because they don't necessarily have the need for in-house translators and interpreters to work there all the time. Now, generally speaking, in the European market, it tends to be the case that translators will work freelance, will work for an agency for a few years before they go freelance. And for interpreters, it tends to be the opposite. Often interpreters will start off as freelancers and then they will maybe apply to work for an international institution or try to pass a test to get into an in-house job in an institution. I work with Chinese, which is a very different market from the European market. So a lot of my students, they tend to go back to wherever they've come from, whether it's mainland China, Taiwan, Malaysia, etc. And they often tend to work for a few years in-house in companies. And these are companies that require interpreters and translators on a daily basis. And some of these people will work for as interpreters or translators in-house for several years. And after a few years, they realize actually they really enjoy the area in which they work in, but they want to do something slightly different. So some of them will go into management, into consulting, etc., in the company. So I guess it's important also to remember that interpreting and translating skills can be very transferable skills, which means that the skills that you learn as an interpreter and translator can be used in many different professions. So I gave the example of consecutive interpreting and standing in front of an audience and performing. Well, this is a skill that you need if you're going to do a presentation to a company or a board of directors, etc., etc. Some of these students will then, after working for a few years in-house, will then go freelance. Working freelance as an interpreter can be quite difficult at the beginning because it's difficult to make ends meet because you don't necessarily have a clientele. But once you've established a clientele and established a reputation, things can get much easier. Same goes for translation as well. As Catherine mentioned just now, if you are a UK national, you can no longer work in-house for the European Union institutions because of Brexit. But of course, you can still work for the institutions as a freelancer. And I, for example, have Chinese, so I work for the institutions between Chinese and English. If you had other languages, you could do the same as a British national in a freelance capacity. For institutions like the UN or other organizations where the UK is a member state, then obviously they still have, you still have the possibility of applying to work either in-house or as a freelancer. And as it was already mentioned just now, there is very big demand for English native speakers. So if you are a UK national and you want to work for an international organization, this is a language as a mother tongue which is very highly sought after.
Now, this is a question that we're often asked at webinars, a very relevant question. And with apologies to George Orwell, I think the situation can be summed up as follows. All languages are equal, but some languages are more equal than others. What do I mean by that? I mean that certain language combinations open certain doors. So we've already mentioned that English mother tongue interpreters are highly sought after. And that's not only because there are fewer and fewer people studying languages in the UK, it's also because nearly all international organisations have English as one of their official languages. Good examples are, of course, the EU and the UN, but there are many more. In terms of which languages open which doors, there are certain constraints which it's maybe helpful to know about. And I've put a couple on the slide here. So, for example, in the EU, to be eligible for an interpreting accreditation test as a freelancer in the English booth, you need to have either French or German plus one other EU language. And similarly at the UN, there is a constraint on the interpreting front anyway. So to work in the English booth at the UN, you have to have French as a passive language. And the UN works in a very particular way in the Chinese booth. The Chinese booth traditionally works between Chinese and English. The Arabic booth traditionally works both ways between Arabic and French. Exotic languages can be a real asset. For example, at the moment in the EU, if you have Irish, you'll be snapped up by the English and Irish booth. So that's, I don't know if we have any Irish people in the audience today, but if you speak good Irish, you can train to interpret from Irish into English and vice versa, and that you'll be very popular with the folks in Brussels. That's for interpreting. Now, for translation, it's a bit different, of course, and it's a bit more flexible, I would think. So, for example, at the UN, you don't need French to work as a translator into English. Catherine's already mentioned that translators always work into their mother tongue, almost always. Whereas, as was evident from the previous slide about the different types of interpreters work into their mother tongue and sometimes back into one of their foreign languages. That's known as having a retour, the French term. So perhaps this is also a good moment to explain how we classify languages in the interpreting world. In the interpreting world, languages are referred to as your A, your B, or your C languages. Your A language is your mother tongue, or its strict equivalent. And that's the language into which interpreters work from all their other working languages in both consecutive and simultaneous interpretation. A B language is a second active language. You don't have to have a B language, but if you do have one, it's a language in which you're perfectly fluent, but which is not your mother tongue. So it's a language, again, that the interpreter can work into from one or several of their other working languages. It's a second active language. And finally, a C language is one which the interpreter understands perfectly, but into which they don't work. It's a passive language for the interpreter. So, for example, I work into English. My A language is English, so I work in the English booth. I actually don't have a B language, and I have 3 C languages, French, German, and Spanish. So I work from French, German, and Spanish into English. So if you see that terminology, that's what it means. And I think there's maybe just one other question which it might be useful to address here. People often ask, how many languages do you need? And again, I'll have to give a fairly ambivalent answer because it simply depends on the market. For translation, it can be sufficient to have just one language combination. And a good example would be German into English. There's lots of work from German into English translating. You could get enough work to earn a good living working from German into English alone. For interpreting in Europe, on the private market, there's strong demand for German into English, English into German, French, English both ways, Spanish, English both ways. In the EU institutions, you would maybe start with just a couple of languages. So say French and German into English, but then you would maybe try and add another 1 or 2. And certainly some of the staff interpreters in the EU institutions have several languages. So that's all on languages.
So what do I need to become a translator or interpreter? Obviously, we've talked about a passion for languages. 60% of you said that you had a passion for languages. It's already good. Hopefully it will be 100% by the end of this talk. Aptitude is really important. When we are selecting students for our programs, for example, we are looking for aptitude. As Louise said, we're not looking for a finished product. We're looking for someone who shows the right profile and who shows the right aptitude to be learning either translation or interpreting. One of the things we have to have is a high level of competence in our mother tongue. Obviously, we speak our mother tongue on a daily basis, but to be an interpreter or a translator means you have a much higher requirement in terms of the proficiency that you have in your mother tongue. Because as Louise said, you're often interpreting from your C languages into your mother tongue, and the output has to be articulate, has to be clear and coherent. You have to have a good understanding of your passive languages as well, or your B languages as well. General knowledge is absolutely key, because if you have a knowledge in a specific area, then it can really help you when you're interpreting or translating. So, for example, if you go into a meeting or you're doing a translation about legal issues and you know nothing about the law, it can be very, very difficult to understand what the speakers or the writers are actually trying to say. Curiosity is key as well. I'd say all interpreters and translators tend to be very curious about many things. And it's really about whether you care about the issues that you're dealing with on a daily basis. So you don't have to be an expert. Interpreters and translators tend to be a jack of all trades. If you're working for a specific institution, obviously you may have a bit more, if you're working for a specific institution, you may have a specific knowledge in a particular area because you're working on that topic all the time. But generally speaking, you're a jack of all trades. So you have to be curious about these things. Do you care, for example, whether a Jaffa cake is actually a cake or a biscuit or even a cookie for the Americans? That kind of thing is going into that level of detail sometimes. Analytical and research skills are absolutely key. And I think this is analysis, the capacity to analyze either a text or a speech is absolutely key, because what you're doing is you're trying to extrapolate a message from a speaker or a writer and then conveying that in another language. Now, I think we're speaking fairly clearly here today, but when you work as an interpreter, you don't often get very coherent speakers. So the job of the interpreter is to put those pieces together and create a coherent whole from sometimes bits and pieces. Research skills is absolutely key as well. The ability to be able to research before your job and then do your homework after your job so you're ready for the next job is absolutely key. And that's where the curiosity and the interest comes in as well. So one of my first jobs as an interpreter was on artificial insemination in water buffalo. When I saw the topic, I was absolutely horrified. I thought, how on earth am I going to do this? But I did the research. I tried to look up as much as I could, and I did a reasonable job, I think. But I came out of that meeting feeling that life is an incredible thing. So it can also be a very rewarding experience as well. Memory is important, because if you are doing interpreting especially, you have very good short-term memory. And if you're going to be a translator or proofreader, editor, précis writer, etc., I think attention to detail is absolutely crucial. And of course, you have to be adaptable and professional. Especially, I think it's very important to know how to deal with your clients, the people you're working for, whether as an interpreter or a translator. This is a really crucial part of being a freelancer and in-house professional, is being able to deal with people and having the right skills to deal with difficult problems and tricky situations.
So here are some of the routes that you might take into the translation and interpreting professions. Traditionally, it was not quite so strict. A lot of my older colleagues came in via a sort of non-standard route where they had exceptional language skills, but they didn't necessarily have a formal qualification as a translator or interpreter. These days, it is much, much more common to have either a master's degree in translation or an equivalent level diploma. And we've listed here a few of the options. So an MA in translation or interpreting, or both. And you might choose to study for that in the UK or abroad, depending on a number of factors, not least cost, but also whether you want to go and spend some time in a country where the languages that you translate from are spoken. There are pros and cons to that. The other option would be to take a qualification administered by the Chartered Institute of Linguists, CIOL, and the standard one is the Diploma in Translating, the DipTrans. This is something that you can study for more independently and might well suit people who are changing careers, already having worked in a different profession for a couple of decades, for instance. And the CIOL also administers the Diploma in Public Service Interpreting, And you can find details about all of these qualifications on their website. There's information there on how to prepare, what the expectations are, and so on. So really, either a master's degree or an equivalent level diploma are the standard entry routes these days. A few people do come into the professions with non-standard qualifications, but it's much rarer. Next slide, please, Louise. Thank you. And if you choose to pursue an MA course, there are a number of things that you want to be looking for in the course that you choose. The most obvious one is what language combinations the course offers, because not all courses have the staff to offer all languages. It's simply not feasible logistically. At Bath, for instance, we offer on the European side, French, German, Spanish, Italian, and Russian, but other universities might offer Arabic or other languages as well. And of course, we have the Chinese stream, but they are separated out. But you'll want to look at what languages are taught. That's the most obvious thing. You'll then need to consider the reputation of the institution that you're looking at. The Association Internationale des Interprètes de Conférences, the International Association of Conference Interpreters, AIC, keeps a directory of interpreting schools, and you will find that on the AIC website. You'll also find that there are a number of institutions around the world, mostly universities, that have memoranda of understanding with either the United Nations or the European Union. For the UN, for instance, if you Google UN Network, MOU, and Universities and Translation, you will find a website that lists all of the partner universities that the UN has. You will also want to consider what the focus of the course is, whether it's a practical course or a more theoretical course. And that will depend entirely on what your interests are and what you want to do when you have the qualification. Look at the modules that are offered and whether they are, again, more practical, more literary, more technical, depending on the kind of thing you're interested in and the kind of skills that you have and think you can build on and develop. Look at the teachers that are employed and what their experience and areas of interest are. It's not going to be much use doing a technical translation degree with somebody who specializes in literature and vice versa. And we all have our strengths and weaknesses, and we tend to play to those. There are also ties between international organizations and other employers that the universities might have, and it's worth looking at these to see what the opportunities might be and where recent graduates have got work. Thanks, Louise.
Thanks, Catherine. So this is the part of the presentation where we want to tell you a little bit about what we have to offer at the University of Bath, which, as you know, is where we all work, where we all teach. We offer 4 programmes in translating or interpreting, each with a different focus. Essentially, we offer 2 programmes for European languages, the MA in Interpreting and Translating and the MA in Translating and Professional Language Skills. And then we offer 2 programmes for the Chinese-English combination. The courses we offer are practical courses. So this ties in with what Catherine was just saying earlier. We're on the practical side. Our courses are taught by professional linguists and they're driven by the needs of the market. And actually, the MA in Interpreting and Translating on the European side has actually existed for almost 60 years at Bath. So we do have a long history of training in translators and interpreters, especially for international organisations. And we'll just run you through a little bit more detail about each course just very quickly so that you can see how they differ. As I said, we offer 2 European pathways. The MA in Interpreting and Translating is illustrated on the left. I mainly teach on that course because I teach German to English interpreting and also half of the French to English interpreting. The MAIT course, the MATE course, teaches you the skills you need to become a translator and or conference interpreter. So the focus, as you can see here, is on translation, consecutive and simultaneous interpreting. But there's also a range of optional units in skills to support your development as a translator or interpreter. So, for example, public service interpreting, public speaking, so crucial for interpreting, enterprise skills and translation technology, that kind of thing. And there are also extracurricular non-credit bearing units in English law, economics and globalization, and so on. Languages wise, if your mother tongue's English, you'll need 2 languages out of French, German, Spanish, Italian and Russian. And if your mother tongue's Russian, you'll train to work from English into Russian and from Russian into English. So those are the language combinations we support. Now, Catherine teaches on both the MATE and TPLS courses because she teaches translation. So I'll just hand over to Catherine to talk about the TPLS course.
Thanks, Louise. Yes, we teach all the translation modules on both courses together. So the 2 streams are combined. So you'll be working with your translator or interpreter colleagues. But the TPLS stream, this stands for Translation and Professional Language Skills. This focuses much more on the written side of the profession. So we cover editing and revision, as well as translation technology, looking at developments in the market, and you do a dissertation over the summer. There are numerous optional modules in disciplines like proofreading, précis writing, which, as I've already explained, is essentially writing records of meetings of international organizations, particularly the UN, public service interpreting, public speaking, enterprise skills, how you're going to set yourself up as a freelance translator and negotiate exciting things like income tax returns. And then there are the same optional modules as for the MATE course, so the English law and this kind of thing, more extracurricular related to the subject matter that you might be translating texts about. And from both streams, we have graduates who've gone on to work for all sorts of major international organizations. We've listed a few at the bottom there, as well as the EU and the UN, European Central Bank, NATO, UEFA, FIFA, both of those based in Switzerland, the European Patent Office, the International Court of Justice, and other major legal organizations, ministries of defense, private companies, and bodies like Air France or the Foreign Office, all sorts of things.
Now onto the Chinese side. I'll be brief because this is fairly self-explanatory, but on the MATE Chinese side, we have the same as the MATE European. We do consecutive and simultaneous interpreting, and also liaison interpreting and public service interpreting, which are things that Louise explained earlier. We offer on both programs the opportunity to do things like public speaking, because that's really key to be able to do consecutive interpreting well, to be able to speak in front of an audience. And we offer on both programs as well a translation technology unit in the second semester, which is really to familiarize students with the types of technology that are being used out there. On the translation with business interpreting side, also with Chinese, I guess the main highlights of this is that they're very similar to the TPLS program on the European side, except we do put a lot of emphasis on liaison interpreting for business, so that when students go back to mainly mainland China, but other Chinese speaking markets, they often work in-house for companies, and therefore liaison interpreting is going to be really crucial for them as well. Another feature of this program is that we have proofreading and editing, which Catherine has spoken to about at length already. But this is, I think, really key because, as has been alluded already, the translation market in some cases is already moving towards, for certain types of texts at least, is moving towards post-editing of machine translation. So there will be certain types of texts that companies will send to you which have already been translated by a machine or artificial intelligence, and they will ask you to do the post-edit of those texts. So this is a module on this program that we think really meets the needs of the market as they are now, and to meet the needs of the trajectory that we think the market is going in the future.
So I'll just sum up then. We offer a suite of courses. They're all different, these 4 courses, and they have different focuses. But what they have in common is that they're all practical. The teachers are all professional linguists. At Bath, we have close links with international organisations. We have MOUs, Memoranda of Understanding, with the European Parliament and the UN, bringing two tangible advantages for our students. Firstly, workshops and training delivered by staff translators, editors and interpreters, and also the opportunity for our students to go on study visits and placements. And through our alumni, we have links with a wide range of employers of professional linguists, which is great for job opportunities. And as you saw on our previous slides, our students have gone on to work for a variety of employers in a variety of roles. We'd also like to emphasise that the skills that you pick up training as a translator or interpreter are transferable, and they're highly valued by a wide range of employers. That's because they're all about communication, and communication is extremely valuable. We'd like to finish by showing you a short video about the MATE course. This was filmed during our summer interpreting course in June of this year, so it's hot off the press. It'll give you a bit of a flavour of what it's like to study at the University of Bath. It features two of last year's students, which might be of interest to listen to what they have to say, and also the deputy head of the English booth at the European Commission, who was visiting us to help with the summer course. So I'll just play you that now. It lasts about 3 minutes. When our students arrive, they have a love for languages and a passion for learning languages. They have the talent, but they need to learn the skills of the trade, and that's what we teach. This course is for passionate linguists who want to become professional linguists. We train people who love languages in the arts of translation and interpreting. We train them to work at international organisations at the very highest level.
It's a very practical programme. What we focus on at Bath is how you work as a professional. The teachers try to simulate real environments.
All of the teachers on the course are professional translators and conference interpreters. We understand exactly the standard that the market requires, and we can help our students to reach that standard.
Very quickly on the course you realise that interpreting isn't just about word-for-word translations. There's a real emphasis on the course on being able to extrapolate a really clear, concise message and then being able to communicate that.
We have excellent training opportunities with potential employers of interpreters and translators. We signed a memorandum of understanding with the United Nations and with the European Parliament. This allows us to provide training opportunities at the international organizations. Because of Brexit, people tend to think that there aren't as many opportunities to use their languages in the real world. There's actually a huge shortage in both the EU institutions and in the UN at the moment. This is a huge opportunity for you because you have some skills which are highly sought after.
We at DG SCIC very much rely on university courses like this one to train up future candidates. The Bath course in particular is one of our longest standing courses, and we have a long history of cooperation with them, offering our support. It's always rewarding for me to come back and pass on some of my humble experience and advice. We send our trainers to visit the students, and we also invite students on study visits to Brussels.
The highlight of the course so far has definitely been the placements that I've been on. I was lucky enough to be able to go to the UN, where we could practice interpreting and receive feedback from professional interpreters.
The placement in the institutions in Brussels really inspired me that it is possible to take a career as a professional interpreter.
Our students leave this course and they are the interpreters of the future. They're going to be the people who will be interpreting ministers and ambassadors at very high-level meetings.
If you are passionate about languages and you are not afraid to work hard, you absolutely can do it and you absolutely should try. It's so rewarding.
There we are. I hope you enjoyed that. It gives you an idea of what it's like at Bath, and you can see the interpreting labs and so on, and maybe nice to hear from some of our students from last year. So now we've managed to overrun, I'm afraid. I think it's hopefully that just demonstrates our own passion for our subject. But we're happy to stay and answer your questions, and we'll do that now. If you have any questions, please add them to the Q&A. I'm just looking at the Q&A now. We've answered 4 already in writing. So there's a question about dual nationality. Let me perhaps read them out for the recording. What if you have dual nationality? Can you still freelance for EU companies? The only thing you can't do is work as a member of full-time staff if you're only a UK citizen. If you have citizenship of an EU member state, you can work on the full-time staff or freelance. So, I mean, if you have dual nationality and one of your nationalities is an EU nationality, then you can still work for the EU institutions as full-time staff. Another question that we've already answered, does Bath offer a taster day or short courses? And there I've pointed out that our next open afternoon is on the 10th of January 2024. We'd love to see you there if you'd like to come and have a look round. There'll be an opportunity to tour the labs, and we'll also have some talks and an opportunity to mingle and network and so on. Is MA Translation Interpreting still useful to students who've done a BA in Translation and Interpreting? Will the content differ? Yes, well, Catherine has answered that one. An undergraduate degree in Translation Interpreting will set you up very well for the profession, but you'll find a lot of international organisations in particular will require you to have a postgraduate degree. Yes, that is true now that you often need an MA. And then we had a question from Louise who asked about the language requirements for MATE and TPLS at Bath. Yes, so for MATE, you need 2 languages out of French, German, Italian, Spanish or Russian, plus an English mother tongue, or you can be Russian mother tongue and train between English and Russian, or English mother tongue on that path. So that's another option. For TPLS, you have to be English mother tongue, and you can study TPLS with 1 or 2 of the aforementioned languages. So French, German, Italian, Spanish, Russian. Do we do Arabic? No, we don't, I'm afraid, not at Bath, but you will find other universities offering Arabic. And then we have Emily, who says, I'm studying to do an undergraduate degree in linguistics and modern languages. Does a linguistics degree help interpreting and translation? I'd very much endorse what Catherine said here. Yes. Catherine studied linguistics at undergrad and then postgrad, as did I. Yes, I found it particularly helpful when you really need to get into the nitty-gritty of the grammar, or if you have a text written by a non-native speaker, you can sometimes identify the interference that might be causing grammatical issues. Yes, I agree with all of that. Going back to the questions that haven't yet been answered, are there any courses we would recommend to improve source language for a career in translation? And the person who's asked this is interested in improving their English. I don't know whether my colleagues have any thoughts on this, but my first thought is simply that by being in an English-speaking country, or in a country where your source language is spoken, you're going to improve your knowledge of your languages. But of course, nowadays it's so easy to access material online of the appropriate register. So you can listen into parliamentary debates in your source language. You could listen to the UK Parliament if you really wanted to, but that would give you access to the very high register English, which might be very useful. Colleagues, do you have anything to add to that?
Maybe I can add something about the what you should do before coming to do an MA in interpreting and translation. I think there is a misconception that you have to be a language major in order to be able to do a postgraduate degree in interpreting and translation. It doesn't necessarily have to be that way. Some of our students on the Chinese stream, for example, some of my best students have been chemistry majors, physics majors, law majors. They just happen to speak both languages really well. So if you speak these languages that you need at a very high level, but you have an area of expertise, that can be really useful for you. It doesn't necessarily have to be English or other languages.
Thanks, Miguel. That's great. So we've answered that one. There's a question in the chat, which I've noticed, and we can take that too, although I'd encourage you to please put your questions in the Q&A so we don't miss any. Anita says, I'm trying to find out how to become a literary translator. You'll need a specialised course in literary translation, Anita, and it's not something that we offer at Bath, but if you go online and do a bit of a search, I'm sure you'll find a course, either a short course or a full MA in literary translation. Colleagues, do you have anything to add to that?
I was just in the middle of typing an answer, sorry, on a different one, but specifically on the children's literature element of it.
Yes.
We do actually, I'll delete my answer because I'm going to answer it live instead now. We did actually have a student a few years ago who became very interested in translating children's literature, partly because of a piece of coursework she did at Bath on the MA course. And she managed to get a mentorship with an existing literary translator for children's books. And she has now had a book published. I think she's now working on her second one. Off the top of my head, I am afraid I can't remember what the name of the specific program is that she became part of and that she got a mentor through. But if you Google mentorships for children's literature translation, that kind of thing, I'm sure you will find that there are things out there. It was a specific program, I believe, based in the UK, and it meant that she was able to work with an existing translator, a practicing translator of children's literature for, I think, 6 months. So do go out and look if you can find things, because yes, there are specific programs available that would channel you down that line. The Bath course is not particularly geared towards that, but we can point you in the right direction.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Catherine. I hope that helps, Anita, and thank you for putting the question in the Q&A. That's fantastic. Hope that's helpful. 3 more questions, currently still open. Are a degree in languages and the CIOL, DIPSI, I imagine, diploma enough to start with? Yes, I mean, the DIPSI diploma is well recognised. You need, basically, the message is that you need some kind of professional qualification in order to work as a translator and interpreter. And the DIPSI is a professional qualification which allows you to work as a public service interpreter. If you wanted to work as a conference interpreter, then you would need to do some specific conference interpreting training, like, for example, an MA. I hope that helps. If it doesn't, please type another question. Thank you for the question. Then we have, what are the language requirements that international students must have in order to access the University of Bath? Miguel, would you be able to take that one?
Yeah, so if you want to be on the Chinese stream, so the TBI program or the Mate Chinese program, you need to have an IELTS score, which you can find on our website. There is a higher requirement in terms of your IELTS score for the spoken element of the IELTS test. If you're going to study on the Mate Chinese program, which focuses on interpreting, if you're focusing more on the TBI program, you have to have a higher score in your written the written element of your test. So there are English language requirements. It can be IELTS, it could be TOEFL. We also accept PTE, and you can find the specific requirements on our website.
Thank you very much, Miguel. I hope that's helpful. I think there's another question for Miguel here. I have a question on how to get started in audiovisual translation. I studied an audiovisual translation module using WinCaps during my Spanish and German BA, which I really enjoyed. And I'm wondering if I had some advice on how to get started working as a subtitler or audiovisual translator. Which companies should I apply for? And is it possible to become a freelancer without a specific degree in subtitling? So over to you, Miguel.
I'm not very familiar with the way the UK market works for audiovisual translation, because I work mainly for Chinese production companies and Chinese directors directly. So in the UK, I would say my understanding is that you don't have to have a degree in subtitling in order to be able to do subtitling, but it might be useful to get some kind of experience somehow to put on your CV. I'm sure there are number of companies and agencies that will deal with subtitling and audiovisual translation. So it's a question of going online and finding them and sending out your CV to them. Sometimes it's really about the people that you meet and the people you know. So I think if you want to be a subtitle translator, it might be a good idea to first of all keep your options open and work in the translation industry generally, because one of these days you'll meet someone who will say, can you do audiovisual translation? And if you take the job, then that can become part of your portfolio. So these things sometimes have to happen organically. It's not necessarily a very straight line, if that makes sense.
Thanks, Miguel. And I think that possibly brings us to the end of our questions, unless there are any more questions. But actually, looking at the time, we should probably let you get on with your afternoon and go to one of the many other talks that are available at the Language Show. I've just put one final slide up on the screen. If you want to find out more information about the courses at Bath, you can use these two QR codes. The first QR code takes you to some information about the European courses, and the second one to information about the Chinese pathway. And with that, I think it's time for us to say goodbye. We'd like to thank you all very, very much for coming along this afternoon and for your interest in this talk on becoming a translator or interpreter. And we'd like to wish you all the best for your future careers. Please don't hesitate to get in touch with us at the University of Bath if we can be of any assistance, providing any advice or answering any questions. Thank you very much indeed. Goodbye.
Thank you, everyone.